Hello and welcome to the Recreatus podcast. This is episode 4, and today we're talking about the idea of virtual heritage a little bit more specifically. Dr. Bergeron, so let's talk a little bit about some of the projects we've worked on over the years. So, whenever we're talking about virtual heritage, what is one of the first projects you remember working on?
So, my journey in all of this began at a project actually that became my PhD dissertation, and it was to recreate late 19th century downtown Morgantown, West Virginia. And it came out of a curiosity uh, in the early days of looking at historical GIS, which is where my background was before. We began using Sanborn maps and some other things to sort of map the building footprints in the GIS, but then it was a question, do more. And this was about a time when we were starting to see the first projects, ECI, right, Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative, all those things, and got excited to say, well, what if we did this for Morgantown, right? You see it do it for a lot of the we'll call it important monuments, landmarks, and things like that. But what about the use of the technology end of it to document and recreate places that maybe are a little bit less well known and have a local importance? And so we started with Morgantown, and it was really interesting early on because we were using Esri technology, their 3D viewer at the time, ArcScene, and at the same time trying to figure out how to model. So we early on began using Google SketchUp and involving students. So SketchUp began with Atlas software that became part of Google, and now it's known as a piece of Trimble. But we were there for that evolution. It was really interesting because we were pushing the envelope of what the GIS technology could do in the 3D space. And coming up with some very interesting workarounds for crashing and things like that, just because we were at the max, and we ended up with a landscape of over 450 structures from the 1890s in Morgantown and recreated within the space of ArcScene. And so that early time period, that project kind of still is near and dear to my heart because it was where I first started really thinking about not just using graphics to visualize it, but then what's the next step.
And with that project, it was one of the first ones we took into the VR cave system that we had on campus at West Virginia University. Um, And so both of us, of course, graduated from the Department of Geology and Geography at WVU. So we had a lot of experience going on there. That was one project, worked with other people on places like Wheeling, West Virginia. I did a lot more work in terms of the archaeological landscapes, in terms of 3D reconstructions and things like that. But really, it was that ability to take ArcScene into a VR cave that kind of push us more into the virtual portions as opposed to the digital portions of cultural heritage. And really, we started out as more of historic GIS, or I don't know, what term were we using at that point?
Historical GIS, and so, that was around the time when we were starting to see a lot of those projects and a lot of work, in the GIS space to look at, historical landscapes and how they were documented, how we could bring that data in. So, the work of Ian Gregory and others, right, looking at what historical records were out there for certain time periods and how we could leverage the GIS. But that visualization end of it, right, bringing it into 3D. I think for us at WVU, the cave experience, that early cave experience was one, that stuck with me at least in what I try to do beyond that, because things that just didn't make a lot of sense in the cave environment, and so many of us were at that point, I think, working on just the mechanical end, the technology end of getting things into it, that we hadn't yet begun to really grapple with what is it we really want in there? Like, how do we want to pull this information in? And the Morgantown project for me was that attempt to do that. So that first stage was just getting the landscape in there. What could I recreate? But then it was, well, what do I want people to do if they're in the landscape? And that was where the cave came in, and some of the early prototypes where we had our 3D question mark boxes trying to say, how can we get people to interact with this landscape, right? How is it more than just a passive viewer kind of experience. And so those questions that we were grappling with, and others were as well, really were a grounding in how our own work in this space has evolved over, gosh, it's been over a decade now.
I won't say that how long it's actually been, but
Yeah.
we'll leave
Over
that
a decade is not wrong.
we'll leave that alone. Um, I think kind of the big thing that the cave showed us was the limitations, of course, with the historic GIS perspective, that it was great for getting the data, getting the points, polygons, lines all available for us to use in a way, but it showed us the limitations of those simple boxes and the need then to move to SketchUp. And then the interaction limitations of the GIS kind of reared its head as we were in the cave, and that's when I think the big push into game engines really started, within the project and the various projects since then as well.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and it was running parallel with what other people were discovering. So, right around the time that we were working on some of this is when Google Earth was released, and then I forget how long after, but Google Earth had that awareness layer and began to have interactive stuff. So, the pop up photos, the things that were happening in Google Maps, right? So, in a space that was parallel to this more traditional GIS space, and that was where that was kind of an intermediary and started to bring at least me to grapple with what's really the interaction, right? What makes it more than just looking at a GIS and saying, "Oh, I can click on it and I can bring up an attribute table. I can do all these things and they're important." But if I want to move towards experience and take away the just that real abstractness of working in the expert space, what really can we need to do? And so that was the spatial multimedia kind of development. Now a lot of that stuff is just sort of taken for granted, but that progression and then the move into game engines was now we're talking about an experience that brings a narrative, and again, lots of things are happening over these years. So I guess now I'm thinking about it's like 20 years, not 10. To go back to your previous comment, but as those things are evolving, right, we're looking at, what makes something compelling for people to wanna follow it through to the end. And so then we see the development, right, of story, of the idea of spatial story, which was not a new thing, and in the video game space, environmental storytelling, is key in that sort of narrative-driven movement through the landscape of a video game, or even a 2D video game, right? You're moving through the space to add the elements to get to the end and starting to think more about the holistic experience, which is something in GIS we hadn't really done. Even though we have our cartographic products, right, which are a snapshot of our work and they're a message we're trying to get out, we hadn't really, I think, been grappling with the long term, sort of longer duration experience, a dynamic experience. And so as those things developed, that was still that initial time spent in just getting things into 3D, first into the GIS, then into the VR, and then stepping back from VR into the video game space. And we worked in an engine called XNA Game Studio, which was when Microsoft tried to get into indie game creating. It was really very successful, and then that evolved into what is now Unity. So. Through a series of steps when XNA was no longer gonna be supported, some developers got together and, they'd already been kinda working on how to get some of that functionality into another space. Unity was one of the things that came out of that, and then Microsoft supported it, in a sense by partnership, and so we saw that evolution, but what those types of things have brought to this space, are the notions that we can build the 3D world and think of it as holistic. So not obsess over every exact measurement and just see everything kind of as a data point, which that's still important, but what the difference is in the engine, right, is that the visual experience. So some of the tricks of the trade that really make for an immersive environment. So if you think about video games in that time period, and the one that really inspired my PhD dissertation was a game from a studio called Naughty Dog, who built their game for the PlayStation line of consoles, and it was called Uncharted. But just simply that inspiration, because here was a historical landscape, and you can go and maybe we'll have a link in our notes to find some description of it. But it was historical landscapes, and the idea of looking at the 16th century Spanish sort of colonial landscapes, and a comment from a student, a university student at the time, who started talking about one of the backstories of this video game about Sir Francis Drake, And I'm like, "What?" And he's like, "Yeah, that was in Uncharted." So I said, "Wait a minute, they remembered that." And that's because the story, right, was compelling. So the experience of moving through the landscape had purpose to it, and those types of ideas, which come from entertainment, and literature and things like that, actually have a place in world building, even if we're world building for non-entertainment purposes, right? Because those are things that make people move through the experience and retain it. And so those are areas that I didn't have a lot of experience with, and this is me right in my development. And so I felt I needed to catch up there and also build some pieces of that into future projects, including ones we're working on right now.
So basically, just to kind of summarize, we started out with GIS, very much at a landscape scale. And more recently, we've built through to the more the digital environments, um, and really kind of bringing more of that structural, object oriented type of approach to these projects. Would that be a good summary?
I think and adding in the narrative element.
Yeah.
So,
Well, to be fair, I mean, we've been talking about spatial narratives the entire time for
yeah,
20 years, vignettes,
yeah,
how do we tell the story? These have been conversations we've had,
yeah.
between us, our advisor, our other, grad, student fellow grad students at the time.
And
They
the
were constant
evolution.
conversations.
Yeah, and the evolution is how to implement it, right? And so now I think that there are lots of really good examples that are coming out of more of these. Uh, yeah, I think environmental narrative, I think spatial narrative, right? But essentially, it's storytelling through movement, and what you embed in there has to be interactive. But it's moving away from things that are so obviously not part of the world, to something that's a little bit more, uh, almost like something you'd encounter, right? Like how you would learn by exploring yourself, right? You'd walk up to a tree and go, what kind of tree is this? And so now you have ways to have either a pop up or maybe a voice, something say, "Whoa, as it turns out, this is a maple tree." And, so as opposed to before when you'd say, "All right, I'm going to click on this point, and I'm going to see an attribute table with a row," right? So, and it's that visual. So again, emphasizing the experience and making it feel as if you're on kind of a journey.
Yeah. So basically, we started out with history and archaeology, came into geography, looked at these areas, and just kind of took off with them. But that's where we'll end for the day and leave more of the conversations about some of the specific projects for later on, especially Hampton, which hopefully we'll have an
Yeah.
example
So
of by the end of the
yeah,
first season.
and more current projects even for contemporary, a place in contemporary Japan.
Yep. Okay. So be sure to come back for the next episode of the Recreatus podcast.